Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with parapsychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we're going to explore Martin Heidegger's philosophy of technology. My guest is Jason Reza Jorjani, who is a philosopher and author of Prometheus and Atlas, Lovers of Sophia, novel Folklore, World State of Emergency, Iranian Leviathan, and most recently, Prometheism. Once again, this is an internet interview, and now I'll switch over to the internet video. Welcome, Jason. It's a pleasure to see you once again. We're going to be exploring a really fascinating topic, Heidegger's philosophy of technology.
Indeed, and I'm looking forward to it.
I guess one of the starting points is that unlike many people who assume that technology is an outgrowth of science, Heidegger pretty much assumes the opposite, that science is an outgrowth of technology.
Heidegger, beginning even in Being and Time, before his later, more explicit writings on technology, argues that man's relationship to tools precedes theoretical scientific thinking and is the ground of it. Anthropologically speaking, of course, technology precedes science. And as we've discussed in a previous program on Heidegger, Heidegger believed that, even the most basic scientific enterprises like geometry require certain tools in order to elaborate their concepts. And science requires technology in an anthropological sense as its precondition. But Heidegger is saying something more fundamental than that merely anthropological claim. He thinks that there's something about scientific theorization that is always already trying to inframe and control nature, that there's an instrumental will involved in what appear to be even the most abstract scientific theories, which is bent on a domination, inframing, and control of nature, what he sometimes calls machination, going back to the Greek word mechane, which is the root of our word for mechanics, but also of machination. So there's a kind of psychological machination that is the source of mechanical enterprises in the history of technology.
In other words, scientists today, many of them would say that, especially theoretical scientists, are purely in it for the search for knowledge. And Heidegger is saying something different, that science is really all about control, not knowledge.
That's right. Heidegger thinks that there is a kind of ungraspable dimension to nature, which he sometimes calls the Abgrund, the abyssal background. It is revealed that theoretical science is not a mirror of nature, but is a model building enterprise when you recognize the limits to the instrumental approach toward nature, where, nature is revealed to be ungraspable. One also sees reified, one also can see highlighted the practical or instrumental character of the scientific enterprise, that really our scientific theories are not mirrors of nature, they're models of the world. And they're models that we build for practical purposes. So this is one of the first insights that Heidegger has regarding the nature of technology, and that's that technology is ontologically prior to theoretical science. And so, for example, theoretical science in its quintessential modern sense, scientia, when the word scientia in Latin started to be used to demarcate what used to be considered natural philosophy or episteme among the Greeks, that moment with, say, Francis Bacon and Descartes, René Descartes, took place after the manufacture of the first complex tools and, clocks with very intricate gearworks in the Renaissance. And what you had in that epoch was the breakdown of very complex instruments that were much more complex in the various, gears and mechanically reproducible components that they incorporated. And so, when you had this breakdown phenomenon occur, the thinkers in the Renaissance began to see nature as a gigantic clockwork. And, the manufacture of identical replacement parts for these complex gearworks gave them, the idea that nature might work in the same way. And so you had a resurgence of the atomic theory and a thinking in terms of elementary particles. And in this way, you can see that it's a certain psychosocial relationship with technology that is the basis for the elaboration of concepts in modern theoretical science.
I know we've had several earlier discussions in which you've pointed out that this mechanistic picture we have of the world is based on technology and not necessarily at all reflecting the actual findings of theoretical science. It may well be, as many of our guests on this program suggest, that the universe is more like a great thought than a great machine.
Yeah, let me just say a few words about that in relation to my most recent work. I thought recently, in recent months, in the past year or so, I've thought very deeply about the idea of a simulacrum, and the possibility that we're living in some kind of a programmed cosmos. And David Bohm's ideas about the holographic universe were a very early influence on me, and it's a way of thinking about nature that I've returned to recently. And in that context, I want to say a few words about the way in which I built off of the thought of Heidegger's that you just summarized in Prometheus and Atlas. In Heidegger, there is a sense that this ungraspable dimension to nature, which shows the limits of the instrumentality of modern science and the technological nature of modern science, that this ungraspable dimension to nature has to do with biological processes. It has to do with a quality of organic life which exceeds the mechanical and is ungraspable by anything instrumental. And Heidegger here is under the influence of Wilhelm Dilthey, who's thinking about organisms and biology is in the same school as Henri Bergson. It's a kind of vitalism. And in Prometheus and Atlas, I had put Heidegger next to Bergson in order to make a case that certain, what we would call psi phenomena, that you see in plants and animals, that you see all the way down to the level of bacteria, as far as the world of organisms, the world of biological life, the domain of biological life. The psi phenomena that you see when, an animal can find its way back home across country when it's lost, or, the kind of biocommunication that Cleve Baxter observed in plants, that this somehow was illuminating that instrumentally ungraspable dimension to nature that Heidegger was getting at in his writings on technology. And I recently had reason to reconsider that, because I think it's quite possible that instead of coming face to face with some, romantically conceived irrational in nature, a dimension of vitality, of life that cannot be mathematically modeled. What we're really dealing with here is what chaos theoreticians are grappling with when they talk about the irrational or chaos as an incredibly complex degree of order. And so, there are certain very simple equations that express dynamics in nature where, certain processes are highly sensitive to fluctuations in initial conditions. For example, the weather patterns. And what you find is that you can model such phenomena mathematically, but your mathematical descriptions of them do not have predictive power, at least not precisely predictive power. And in that sense, we are dealing with processes on a biological level that are in a certain way irrational. And I think that this does demarcate certain limits to the instrumental approach of modern technology, but not in the same mystically romantic sense that I think, is in the back of Heidegger's mind, that he implicitly subscribes to, and that's reflected in the parts of Prometheus and Atlas where I am putting his thoughts on technology next to Bergson's.
Well, I suppose it's fair to say that many of the modern developments in mathematics relating to chaos theory and catastrophe theory and so on came after Heidegger.
Yes, and see, the point is this, and we'll come back around to this as we go through other main ideas in Heidegger's philosophy of technology. There are basically a handful of them, and this is going to become relevant again when we get to the idea of the age of the world picture. But basically, the point is this, that chaos theory and fractal geometry is used today by computer programmers in order to model simulated worlds. Some of these computer games that have hundreds of simulated worlds in them are built up using the algorithms of fractal geometry and basically working with chaos theory. And so what you have is a situation where the programmers are designing these worlds. They are in a sense engineering these artificial universes, but they cannot predict exactly what form the evolution of artificial nature inside these worlds will take, let alone, what the various entities, that arise within these worlds, will do. It's not precisely predictable. And so if you take that and apply it back to our world of lived experience, it means that you can have a cosmos that is both mathematically describable and also allows for free will.
Well, Heidegger seems to imply, with his focus on technology, that technology has I'm going to say it simply, the capability of transcending itself.
Yes, and this brings us to the second major idea in Heidegger's philosophy of technology, which is that there is something about the human being's capacity for self-transcendence that's related to the way in which technology is always transcending itself. Heidegger recognizes that, unlike all of the other beings in nature, humanity is lacking in an essence. In our case, our existence precedes our essence. Various other animals and organisms in nature have what Aristotle called a species being, a kind of instinctual pattern of behavior that's genetically hardwired. Human beings lack that. And, this lack is also a dependence on technology that is even more primordial than the being of Homo sapiens. It was our crafting the simplest stone implements that allowed us to prepare food in a way, and also, our working with fire allowed us to prepare food in a way that actually affected our morphological development, like, the change in the shape of our jaws. And the dexterity of the human hand, which is something Heidegger makes a big deal out of, also would have evolutionarily been in a kind of feedback loop with the crafting of simple tools and the manipulation of nature using tools. So tool use, the most basic form of technological being, precedes properly human being and brings it into existence. And so ironically, when we think about, how all of these modern technologies, technologies of the coming singularity threaten to dehumanize us and challenge the fundamental parameters of human existence, it's somewhat paradoxical, because without technology, we wouldn't have been human in the first place. So exactly what it is that threatens our humanity is what made us human in the first place. And this is an insight that Heidegger has, and that other thinkers after Heidegger have developed. This insight into how human existence is inherently problematic and questionable because of our inextricable relationship with technology. In particular, Bernard Stiegler, French contemporary thinker, has specifically related this idea in Heidegger's philosophy of technology to the myth of Prometheus and of his brother Epimetheus, where, in the version of the myth that's recounted by Plato in his dialogue Protagoras, it's recounted that Epimetheus, Prometheus's forgetful brother, whose name means afterthought, implores Prometheus to allow him to participate in the creation of man. And Epimetheus has delegated various qualities to different beings in nature. He's given them, as Aristotle would put it, their species being, and done so in a way where they can fend for themselves in nature. But he forgets to reserve any particular quality for man. So man is left, speechless and without any defining quality. We're sort of the man without qualities. And as a remedy for this, Prometheus steals fire, the light of science and the fire of the forge of technological development from the gods. And this becomes what's definitive of humanity. So Prometheus's theft is a remedy for Epimetheus's forgetfulness. And, Stiegler points to the deeper symbolic meaning of this in terms of the two Greek ideas of Promethea, forethought, thinking ahead, anticipatory resoluteness, as Heidegger would put it, on the one hand, and then Epimethea, which is kind of forgetfulness and absent-mindedness, and a kind of what he compares to the idea in Heidegger of slipping into an unreflective adherence to mass consciousness. So Heidegger has this thought of, the they, the mass man, das Mann, basically the herd mentality. And Epimethea is that aspect of human existence which is always inclined toward the lowest common denominator. It kind of has a gravitational attraction toward being absorbed in collectivist thought and being undifferentiated as part of the mass and being forgetful. And this is also related to the Heideggerian conception of truth, which reaches back to the Greek idea of aletheia. Epimethea is very much comparable to the idea of lethomai. The Greeks had this notion that there's a predominating occultation or concealment or forgetfulness at work in nature and in life, and that truth is always exceptional. To see the truth about something is to make a discovery. It's to uncover what is predominantly covered over, or generally concealed or occulted. And so truth in the Greek sense, aletheia, is a privative of lethe or lethomai, of covered overness or forgetfulness. And so every discovery of a truth is kind of a Promethean act of theft. And an act of rebellion against predominating occultation and concealment. This is another thing that Stiegler points out, in terms of the myth of Prometheus and Heidegger's insight about humanity's fundamental existential relationship with technology. And another point that he makes is that the very notion of existence in Heidegger is connected to the way in which Prometheus puts us outside and ahead of ourselves. So by gifting us with technology, Prometheus is making human existence prosthetic. You know, all of our tools are in a sense prostheses. It's not just, you know, the peg leg or the prosthetic arm or future, you know, cybernetic implants that are prosthetic. But in a way, all of the technologies that we depend upon, and but for which we would not even have the morphology that we do, are prostheses. And so this means that we're always outside of ourselves. And that's related to the basic meaning of the word existence. To exist, as in the word exit, means to be outside oneself. And Heidegger makes a lot out of the fact that Dasein, their being, his term for the human, is the only life form that exists, properly speaking. Other animals have an ontological modality that is not, strictly speaking, existence. And one of the reasons why Heidegger doesn't use the word human is because he wants Dasein, their being, to apply to any form of life in the cosmos that would have, you know, this kind of Promethean being outside of itself. And we also have it being ahead of ourselves. You know, Heidegger says that the future is the predominant mode of temporality, of our experience of time. We are sort of always already anticipating what is to come. Our thought has an intentional structure that always runs ahead of itself, and this is the ontological ground for our being able to prepare for the future the way that, you know, the Promethean thinker does. And so this being outside of and ahead of ourselves is another characteristic of Heidegger's existential ontology that Stiegler describes as in some way fundamentally related to the Prometheus myth.
So just as Epimetheus, the brother of Prometheus, the forgetful brother of Prometheus, that name means afterthought. The name Prometheus really means forethought.
That's right. It means forethought. And it is grounded in the fact that the human being experiences time in a way where the future is always dominant, where, you know, we are always reinterpreting our past in terms of a projection of our future. And this is the existential basis for being able to plan and prepare for the future, to make provisions and to develop projects. The idea of the project is fundamental to Heidegger's analysis of human being. We are projective beings in a way that no other creatures are. And one could even imagine, you know, quasi-intelligent beings who didn't have that characteristic. And if we were to chance upon such beings, Heidegger would say that they're not Dasein.
Now, speaking of the future and this idea of projecting into the future, you used a term earlier that I'm not sure all of our viewers would understand. You talked about the singularity.
Yes, and you know, this is another way in which Heidegger's philosophy of technology is futuristic and ahead of its time. So the singularity, it's a term that comes from, you know, theorizing about black holes in physics. It comes from the study of singularities in physics, vortices that represent a total loss of information, vortices that cannot be mathematically modeled. So the technological singularity, just very briefly, is that point on a graph that models exponentially increasing developments in technology. You know, the convergent advancement of technologies at an exponential rate. That exponentially upward curving graph hits a spike at a certain point. And that spike is basically the singularity. It's like a wall on the graph. And at any point on that chart before the spike, you can use earlier points to project a future moment in the development of technology. And, the projections will be more or less accurate. They're probabilistic, but at least you can make a projection. Once you hit the spike, there's no way that you can project from what came before it to what will come after it. And that's what's being described by people in the tech world as the technological singularity. Heidegger foresees this, in a sense. The third major idea in his philosophy of technology is that technological science is teleological. That it has a kind of goal-directedness. Telos in Greek is a purpose, an aim, or an end. And in all of those senses, technological science, which Heidegger expresses, as a single idea, techno-science, since science is always already technological, techno-science shapes human history into distinct and successive epochs that each have a horizon delimiting the possible concepts and ideas that can be arrived at in that epoch. So there is a developmental trajectory that begins with Platonic idealism. It begins with Plato's elaboration of abstract concepts, the forms, the eidos, that are used in his thinking to inframe nature, and then that, are developed by Aristotle into one of Aristotle's four causes. This is the starting point of a trajectory that then goes through the medieval conception of the certainty of God's existence. Once you develop the idea of an omnipotent and an omniscient God, which is an idea that was alien to the Greeks and to pagan antiquity in general, once you develop that idea, you also wind up with a concept of certitude that was not proper to classical antiquity. Again, going back to what I was saying earlier about aletheia, the Greek conception of truth was of a kind of exceptional illumination, a kind of extraordinary discovery or unconcealment in the midst of predominating occultation. It's like, light shining through a clearing in a dark forest. Truth is exceptional or extraordinary in that way and rare. And this changes very much by the time you get to Descartes, where he has the concept of truth as veritas. And in his metaphysical meditations, Descartes calls into question the reality of the external world because he wants to, from the ground up, admit only that into his epistemology which can be guaranteed to have absolute certainty. And this standard of certainty, which becomes fundamental to modern science, is based on the idea of the certainty of God's existence, which develops in the scholastic Middle Ages. Heidegger points to this as the midpoint, in the trajectory of the development of techno-scientific thought, is the medieval idea of the certainty of God's existence being a kind of constructive illusion that becomes the prototype for the idea of rational certainty in modern science. And so that's the scholastic epoch. And then we wind up with the modern scientific era, beginning with Descartes. And there you have the subject representing in his consciousness structures of an objectively existent material world. So there's the distinction between the res cogitans, the mental substance, and the res extensa, the mathematically describable material substance. And knowledge becomes a question of adequately mirroring the structure of the objectively existent world in the polished mirror of one's mind. What ironically takes place in the course of modern science with its emphasis on empiricism is that this will to truth, this will to certainty, what Nietzsche calls a will to truth, reverses itself. It inverts in a way, because the will to truth that in the classical epoch took the form of the Platonic ideas and then of medieval scholastic certainty of God's existence, and then ultimately the truth of the scientific theories that we are using to represent, that we develop as representations of nature, it becomes the case the more empiricism is emphasized, and we wind up with something like the Darwinian theory of evolution coming from out of empirical science, or once we develop a behavioral psychology from out of the emphasis on empiricism in science, we realize that this will to truth has always been a will to power, and that it really expresses a kind of instrumental intentionality to basically dominate and control nature and to reshape nature, including human nature. It's not a question of understanding some objectively existent nature. It's a question of basically taking control over the world and over our own existence. And this is, in the history of ontology where we get to Nietzsche, reflecting on Darwinian evolution and developing the concept of the will to power. Heidegger sees all of that as a kind of teleological succession of epochs, each with a horizon that delimits the concepts that are possible inside it. In other words, however much Nietzsche admires the thought of Heraclitus, it would have been impossible for a Nietzsche to think the way that he did in the epoch of Heraclitus. That way of thinking was simply outside of the horizon that bounded the worldview of that age. And Heidegger believes that we are now heading into something called the age of the world picture, the culmination of technological inframing and the threat of the total instrumentalization of human existence. And that's the next idea that we can discuss in terms of Heidegger's philosophy of technology.
I gather that's an idea that is sometimes referred to as the end of history as we know it, that the change will be so radical that our most basic constructs of time and space themselves will become radically different.
Yes. So it is the end of history, and Heidegger sees it that way. The fourth idea in his philosophy of technology is that technological science not only has a teleological developmental trajectory, it's also apocalyptic in nature. That teleology, it's not just aiming, it's not just goal-directed, but it is headed toward an end in the sense that Hegel discussed an end of history. And that end is a moment when industrial processes and modalities of representation, such as radio and television and the motion picture, modern industrial manufacturing, the large-scale projects in modern science involving devices like particle accelerators, and then the whole machinery of representation and the mediation of human experience through representation, initially with the radio, then ultimately with the television, and so forth. It is bringing us to a moment where there is a danger of the total instrumentalization of human existence, where our possibility of living an authentic life is threatened, where it's possible that we will wind up becoming more like things than persons. And, this will degrade our capacity to act conscientiously and to even reflect on the rationale for the various scientific and technological projects that we're pursuing. So Heidegger is alarmed at an increasingly unreflective quality to scientific research programs. He thinks that they're increasingly determined by institutional interests that institutional interests that are defined by the outcome of previous experiments, which, again, in a vicious feedback loop, are determined by market forces. And, there's this way in which our lives are being set up the way that, actors are directed on a movie set, and we find ourselves inside of a production with no identifiable director. It's like a kind of autonomous movie production set where anything is only real. Anything is only real if it has been sort of scripted in advance and been manufactured on the basis of some mold reality becomes, our world becomes increasingly prefabricated. It's basically what Heidegger is saying.
It's not so dissimilar from Colin Wilson's notion that of the robot, that most of us live our lives in an automatic, mechanical way, just like robots, that it takes some real effort to break out of that.
Yes. So, authenticity is a fundamental concept in Heidegger's thought. The ability to extricate ourselves from unreflective mass consciousness and to appropriate our own existential possibilities, and develop projects that, give meaning to our lives and, that in some way authentically appropriate, the resources of our culture and our heritage with a view to future development. I mean, this is how Heidegger understands authenticity and resolutely pursuing projects. And he thinks that there's an increasingly unreflective quality to consciousness in this epoch of the culmination of instrumentalizing technologies, where he says the motion picture. He's writing these things in the 1940s and 50s. He says that the technology of the motion picture will ultimately pervade all other means of communication, which has been demonstrated by the kind of Skype conversation that we're in right now. He's envisioning really a world of simulacra and a virtual reality. And he thinks that we need to somehow take control over these technological forces, but that it can't be done by fiat, because what is driving this total instrumentalization of human existence and the liquidation of reality and its absorption into a virtual reality, into what he calls the world picture, a world that is always already a picture. What's driving it is the will to power. So we can't simply will ourselves out of this situation. We have to become conscious of the forces that are unconsciously, driving this machination. We are kind of in a mesmeric state, and we need to understand what it is that's mesmerizing us, or what it is that, as I described in Prometheus and Atlas, is demonically possessing us to, develop these various industrial technologies and forms of mediation that are ubiquitous in our communications.
Now, I'm under the impression that when you refer to the teleology of science, which is an interesting paradox, and science itself denies the existence of teleology in the universe, that Heidegger is suggesting it's not just science that's teleological. It's deeper. It's built into the very ontology of reality itself. There's some sort of entelechy or purpose that's driving nature forward.
Yeah, he believes that there's certainly a purpose that's driving technological science forward. He believes that there's an essence or spirit of technological science. And, in his last interview, which he asked Der Spiegel to publish only posthumously, he says that philosophy has kind of reached a limit. And, in the face of this threat of universal instrumentalization and a kind of eclipse of being and obliteration of reality as such by technological science, by the inframing or gestell that's characteristic of the age of the world picture, in the face of that, philosophical contemplation as it has traditionally been understood falls short. And he says, quote, only a God can save us now, unquote. And he makes that very provocative remark in the context of a discussion of the future, of the next 300 years, and of the challenge posed by, global technological science. So one then has to ask what God he has in mind when he says only a God can save us now. And in my new book, Prometheism, I point to his rectoral address, the address that he gave when he became rector of Freiburg University in the early 1930s, where he identifies Prometheus as the god of philosophy and science. And he see in that statement that he makes in his rectoral address, he sees philosophy and science as a unified phenomenon. And he says that Prometheus presages and epitomizes the spirit of science and philosophy. And what we need to do is get back to a science that is philosophically reflective and that embodies the Promethean ethos, the ethos of Prometheus in Aeschylus's tragedy. And so I wager that the unnamed God in Heidegger's Der Spiegel interview, who can save us now from this monstrous threat that technological science poses to human existence, this God is none other than the very same demonic force driving the history of technological science. In other words, the spirit of technological science is Janus-faced. It has a shadow side, a kind of Frankensteinian monstrous dimension to it, which is how it expresses itself when humanity remains unconscious of it. And it has another light side, or an illuminating side, an emancipatory dimension to it, which is Prometheus as the liberator of humanity through the gift of the fire of the forge and the light of science. So, I think, and this is very characteristic of the kind of thinking you see in Hegel as well. And, Heidegger, I think, was also largely under the influence of Hegel, unacknowledged to a great extent. In Hegel, you see this concept of aufgehoben, or sublation, of the transformation of something from within its own essence. And I think that that's what Heidegger meant by suggesting that the very same spirit that is demonically threatening our total dehumanization is the God who can also save us from that prospect in this apocalyptic moment. So when we speak about, technological science being not only teleological but apocalyptic, and this brings us to the fifth and final idea in Heidegger's philosophy of technology, it's apocalyptic in the explicit sense in which the Greeks considered an apocalypse a revelation. And so, what is revealed at the end of the world, at the end of history, is a certain divinity, namely Prometheus. And the new God at the end of history is the oldest God. The last God is, in effect, the first God. And so there's a kind of archaeofuturism in Heidegger's philosophy of technology.
Wouldn't it be the case, though, that actually in the history of philosophy, Heidegger sort of stands right in between Husserl, the phenomenologists, and existentialists like Sartre? And the existentialists built on Heidegger's ideas, but they went in a different direction. They went in, I think, a direction of rejection of any thought of the spectral, the idea that I think at the ego level, we are going to recreate ourselves and define our own identities.
This is a tricky question because it's really debatable what even counts for existentialism. Heidegger was somewhat familiar with Sartrean existentialism during his own lifetime, and he saw it as a superficial misappropriation of fundamental concepts in his thinking. I have a lot of respect for Sartre as a deep and rigorous thinker. He's definitely a serious philosopher. Okay. But But I also do think it's the case that in Being and Nothingness, Sartre is laboring under the influence of Heidegger, deep influence of Heidegger, but he's also failing to understand Heidegger. And there's a way in which Sartrean existentialism is really deracinated from Heidegger and even from aspects of Husserlian phenomenology that might have been more open to the spectral. And then when you talk about existentialism in general, well, who's an existentialist? Camus? Camus, there are absurd elements in Camus' thought that are sort of closer to Kafka that, to my mind, really significantly differentiate him from someone like Sartre. So it's very debatable what even counts for, the characteristics of the school of existentialism. And I think that Heidegger is a fundamental thinker in the history of philosophy, whose basic insights will transcend and outlast the demise of any particular philosophical school in the way that Plato's thought transcends Platonism as a philosophical school and endures in its relevance to this day. And that's what I would say about, Heidegger and existentialism.
Will you build upon this notion of Prometheus as, I guess, the savior of humanity? Yeah. Why don't we talk about that a little bit, Jason?
Yeah, so I'm not the first person, to discuss philosophy of technology, in particular, Heideggerian ideas about technological science in the context of the myth of Prometheus. I mentioned Bernard Stiegler earlier in his book Time and Technics, which is subtitled The Fault of Epimetheus, to which he sees Prometheus' theft of fire as the corrective. I mentioned earlier that Bernard Stiegler, discusses Heidegger in the context of Prometheus and suggests that there's a kind of Promethean mythic structure to Heidegger's existential philosophy. But there's also Gunther Anders. Gunther Anders studied under Heidegger in, I think, the 30s maybe, and emigrated to the United States, to California in the 1950s. And he wrote an essay called On Promethean Shame, in which he basically develops these ideas of the Gestell, the setup or enframing, and the instrumentalization of human existence that Heidegger is writing about in the 1930s and 40s. And in particular, his basic notion is that generally, the Promethean is associated with pride, that the Promethean is a kind of excessive pride or hubris having to do with human accomplishment and human creativity and innovation and industriousness. It's, the human pride in our industrious and creative capacity to the point of being so self-assured that we do not owe our existence to anything or anyone but ourselves. It's the modern will to be the self-made man, to become the authors of our own existence. And so, the Promethean is generally described in terms of a Promethean pride. But Anders sees how modern industrial technology, and he's, writing this in the 1950s, modern industrial technology, the factory, the assembly line, the manufacture of the first, jet aircraft and so forth, and even the appliances that are in our kitchens, the increasingly efficient, high-speed appliances that surround us, they are putting us in a position of relative humiliation with respect to their competence, where, the human being, who is born and grown, increasingly comes up short in the face of these extremely effective technologies. So that, for example, the fighter pilot is unable to keep up with the jet whose cockpit he's inside of. And you have a whole project of what Anders calls human engineering to stress test the pilot and reconfigure his body in a way where his reaction time is going to be adequate to the capacities of this aircraft, and so he won't be a drag on the machine. Or, even in the case of the various appliances that we use, he's noting how in the 1950s, at least, people felt like increasingly at a loss in the face of the effectiveness of these appliances, and sort of couldn't even get a handle on them because of the limits of, human dexterity and reaction time and so forth. And the best example that he gives of this, of what he calls Promethean shame of the born and the grown in the face of manufactured things, is an example that has to do with General Douglas MacArthur in the Korean War, where MacArthur was advocating the use of nuclear weapons against North Korea in order to bring that war to a successful conclusion, looking back to Hiroshima and Nagasaki as an example. And instead of countermand him, the president left the decision of whether or not to use nuclear weapons in the Korean combat theater to a computer. This was the era of the first large computers, these wall-sized computers. And they fed the computer this question of whether it would be to the benefit of the United States to use nuclear weapons in the Korean combat theater. And because the computer couldn't evaluate anything in ethical terms, it couldn't decide whether, the liberal values of the United States were worth promoting in East Asia, or, whether the communist government that was being fought against was somehow tyrannical and unjust. These are not terms in which the computer could frame this question. And so instead they asked it whether the use of nuclear weapons would be profitable. In other words, would there be some kind of a counterstrike by China or by Russia on the United States, which would lead to an economic devastation that would make the use of nuclear weapons unjustifiable? And the computer came back and reached exactly that conclusion, that even if, there could be a tactical victory on the Korean peninsula, there would be a counterattack against the continental United States, and it would result in so much damage to the industrial infrastructure of this country and devastate the economy to the point where the use of nuclear weapons was not justified. Now, the ending of the story, the really ironic twist that makes this the perfect example of what Gunther Ander calls Promethean shame, is that after being humiliated by this computer, our last 5-star general, MacArthur, went to work for Remington Rand, the company that manufactured this computer, after he resigned from his career in military service. So he wound up, as a functionary on the board of this company whose computer basically stripped him of his decision-making ability and, insulted his competence for being the person with the capability to discern whether this was a proper tactical decision.
Well, how do you respond when you write about Prometheism to the notion of Promethean shame?
So what I argue in the first chapter of Prometheism, which is called Shamelessly Promethean, playing off of Anders' Promethean shame, is that the description of technology that Anders is offering us in a very Heideggerian vein is too contingent and reflective of the characteristics of technology in the 1950s when he was writing. The critique of modern technological science in Anders' Promethean shame is legitimate with respect to industrial technology in the second half of the 20th century. These kinds of distinctions that he draws between the born and the grown versus what is designed and manufactured are distinctions that are going to be obliterated by advances in the field of biomechanics, for example. So, the more genetic engineering turns the human body, turns the human organism into something designed and manufactured, and the more we integrate manufactured things into our organism cybernetically, the less it makes sense to draw this categorical distinction between the born and the grown on the one hand and the manufactured and designed on the other. And so I think that, the technological singularity promises a kind of total fusion between the human and the technological, which will allow us to overcome the kind of alienation that Anders is describing when he writes about Promethean shame in the 1950s. Where, he says that in the Marxist analysis of alienation, the issue, in the late 19th century, in the late 1800s, the issue that Marxists had with industrial manufacturing was that it led to a sense of dehumanizing alienation on the part of the worker. The alienation of the industrial laborer from his labor, from the product of his labor, because of this dehumanizing system of production. And in a way, there are aspects of Heidegger's analysis of technology that Anders is drawing on that are similar to that Marxist analysis. And Anders is appalled at the fact that in the 1950s and 60s, in his era, the subject who's in a state of Promethean shame no longer laments his alienation, or rather his objectification. He wants to be objectified. He wants to be more like an object, more like a manufactured thing, and has a kind of unconscious and tacit contempt for being born and grown. So people kind of unconsciously want to make themselves more like machines. And Anders sees this as an intensification of alienation. But actually, I think that it's because he doesn't see certain future possibilities of technology that promise an overcoming of alienation through a total fusion of man with the mechanical, in the terms of the biomechanical. And the other dimension of Anders' thought that is playing off of Heidegger, that's being developed from out of Heidegger, particularly Heidegger's idea of the age of the world picture, is the whole notion of simulacra and the mediation of all forms of communication. Anders goes on at length about the radio and television and the way in which they degrade the authenticity of our personal lives and our sense of community. How, the television has replaced the fireplace, it's replaced the hearth in the home, and, at the time that he's writing about this, he sees how the voice of the mass, man, what Heidegger called das Man, the they, is constantly projected at you from out of the television and the radio. And so, whereas people had more of their own voice and they had more of a mental space for authenticity when, we were in a literary culture, and where the most mass medium of communication was a newspaper, in the epoch of radio and particularly television, you're constantly being saturated with the voice of the they. And so this is a temptation to relinquish yourself to total inauthenticity. That description of, and before I continue, let me also add that he expands on the idea in Heidegger that the radio and television rupture our experience of time because they take distant places and they bring them near almost instantaneously, so that, we are constantly projected to faraway places, in a way that makes, our experience of the environment around us increasingly phantom-like. There's a derealization that takes place on account of our being bombarded, by representations, not just of distant places, but of, remote historical periods. And this degrades our sense of time and our experience of place. So, the problem with this kind of analysis is that it's dependent upon the characteristics of these mediums of communication in the second half of the 20th century. It fails to envision truly all-pervasive mediation and interactive simulacra of the kind that we're now beginning to develop. So virtual worlds do not have the one-way quality that, the radio or the television did, certainly in the 50s and the 60s. They're interactive, and we are participating in a narrative that allows us the opportunity to kind of authentically develop and pursue our own projects. And in this sense, I think that Heidegger's insight that, that we are entering a world picture age, an age where the entire world exists only as a picture, is actually more radically insightful than what Gunther Anders develops from out of it. Because what Heidegger is really reaching toward is the idea of virtual reality. Heidegger is sort of prophesying the advent of virtual reality, or of the world as a simulacrum, whereas Anders is stuck in the specific characteristics of radio and television technology in the second half of the 20th century.
And with regard to you, Jason, do you go beyond Heidegger, or are you sticking with him?
No, I most certainly push beyond Heidegger, using some of his fundamental insights in ways that I think he would probably consider perverse. There is this romantic naturalism in Heidegger that I was, hinting at earlier, that Heidegger, although he's never really explicit about it, seems to want to find some way for us to extricate ourselves from this process of instrumentalization and mediation of our existence through modern technology. And instead, what I am advocating in Prometheism is that we become conscious of the archetype that's been driving technoscientific development throughout the course of human history, so that we can most constructively appropriate the ways in which it manifests itself. So that we can, harness the Promethean creative power of innovation and industrious development, rather than having it run loose as a Frankenstein's monster. Certainly, there are various types of biomechanics that would really be dehumanizing, that would lead us into an inhuman future in the worst sense, by degrading our sense of personal identity and our capacity to be responsible and conscientious, by reducing our creativity as individuals. We could wind up using cloning and genetic engineering to decrease human individuality, and to devolve ourselves into a kind of artificial hive mind species. And so what I'm suggesting is that we avert that by becoming conscious of, the spectral force driving these technological developments, and making sure that, for example, biotechnology is used only in ways that are going to enhance us, and take us toward a superhuman and empoweringly superhuman future, rather than a disempoweringly inhuman future. And I think that, that's a prospect that would have unnerved Heidegger. And I think Heidegger would see me as guilty of some of the same Faustian thinking that he laments when he critiques Nietzsche.
Well, before we close, I want to touch a little bit on parapsychology. I know in Prometheus and Atlas, you touch upon the fact that it appears that Heidegger actually engaged in some remote viewing exercises at one time with some of his students. So I know he at least hints at having been aware of the potential of the paranormal. How do you see that fitting into all of this?
Well, it fits in the sense that although the predominant commentators on the technological singularity tend to be materialists and reductionists, people like Ray Kurzweil, for example, people in the tech community that talk about the singularity, tend to have this reductionistic view. But the fact of the matter is that as we approach the technological singularity, some of these research projects themselves, like the quest for artificial intelligence, will make it clear that there are, quantum processes at work in the cosmos that are intrinsically interdependent on consciousness. That consciousness is an intrinsic consciousness is intrinsic to physical processes at a quantum level. And when you want to design a quantum computer, you're going to encounter repeated bottlenecks and obstacles in your research program if you refuse to acknowledge the role of consciousness in physical phenomena at the quantum level. So I think, large-scale, well-funded AI research programs, for example, at places like, MIT and Stanford and Carnegie Mellon, they themselves will come up against the types of extrasensory perception and psychokinesis that have been studied in the parapsychology community. This is also the case with genetic engineering. If you look at Rupert Sheldrake's research on morphic resonance, on what he calls formative causation, he believes that there are formal causes akin to the formal causes in Aristotle's natural philosophy that influence biological development. So that, for example, the morphogenesis of the human embryo is not solely dependent on genetic structure and on environmental conditions in the womb. There is also a morphe, a form of the human species, which is influencing embryological development. And he goes through a number of studies on the mutation of fruit flies using various environmental stimuli in ways that reveal an information structure responsible for the morphology, say, of a fruit fly, or even for the crystallization of certain crystals in nature. It's been shown in the pharmaceutical community that whenever you try to crystallize a certain chemical compound for the first time, it takes longer than any subsequent attempt to crystallize the same compound, say aspirin or whatever medicine some pharmaceutical companies trying to develop. A laboratory that's completely unconnected in a totally different part of the world, on the second or third or fourth attempt to crystallize the same chemical compound, will have it crystallize much faster, and it will have a higher melting point than it did in the first attempt. And what Sheldrake suggests is that there's some atemporal, transcendental information structure which remembers that particular crystallization of those chemicals. And whenever there's an attempt to mix those chemicals the same way, to create that compound the same way in a laboratory, the physical process there, the chemical process there, taps into that information structure and is conditioned by it in a way that allows the crystal to form much more quickly. So to me, what that suggests, especially when you put it in the context of David Bohm's idea of the holographic universe, is that we live in a kind of programmable reality. And a lot of these phenomena that have been studied in parapsychology, like morphic resonance or various ways in which consciousness interacts with physical phenomena at the quantum level, are indicative of the programmable nature of reality. Another example of this that we've discussed, just to briefly reiterate it, another example of this we've discussed in a previous interview is the wave particle duality and the collapse of the probability function in quantum theory. Computer scientists who looked at that have seen a striking similarity between that and what they call rendering optimization inside of a computer simulation, where no entity is rendered until and unless it's being observed, and this kind of this conserves processing power in the system as a whole. So I think that as we approach the technological singularity, a lot of these hardcore research programs in AI and biotech will come up against some of the same phenomena that have been studied in the history of parapsychology, and we'll have to grapple with them.
Well, Jason, Reza Jorjani, what a stimulating conversation. I'm just thrilled to be back with you again and to appreciate the range and depth of your thought. And I'm also thrilled to be able to let our viewers know that we have a few more planned this week, as a matter of fact, that will be released not very long after this particular interview. Thank you so much for being with me, Jason.
Thank you, Jeffrey. It's been a pleasure, despite the fact that it is a scorching day here in New York. And pardon my occasional lapses. This air condition is coming up against the horrid humidity. Climate change is real, I tell you, Jeffrey. New York is becoming more and more like Florida every day. But despite that, it's been an absolute pleasure. And I hope that on the other side of this pandemic, we can record more programs there in the studio.
And for those of you watching, thank you for being with us.